One of my most sacred tasks as a priest is presiding over the Eucharist with you every Sunday. It's a moving experience for me every single time, and I take the words I say deeply to heart. But there are a few words in Eucharistic Prayer A, in our Book of Common Prayer, probably the prayer Episcopalians have heard the most, that always trip me up when I say them out loud. He stretched out his arms upon the cross and offered himself in obedience to your will, a perfect sacrifice for the whole world. Was it really God's will that Jesus, God's only Son, the Word made flesh, be tortured to the point of death on a cross? That was the question that came up in our Bible study on Tuesday when we read the gospel. Jesus began to teach his disciples that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, we hear in Mark. And when Peter pushes back against the idea that his teacher, his friend, suffer such torment, Jesus rebukes him in perhaps the harshest words he speaks in the Gospels. "Get behind me, Satan." The very suggestion of trying to avoid suffering puts Peter in league with the very personification of sin and evil, the polar opposite of a God who is love and creation and justice. The Son of Man must undergo great suffering, Jesus says. Why, the people in Bible study asked, was Jesus' vast and intense suffering necessary for God's love and creation and justice to be made manifest in this world? What kind of God, what kind of caregiver would require that? That's also what makes me stumble during the Eucharistic prayer. He stretched out his arms upon the cross and offered himself in obedience to your will. What kind of God would call for that kind of obedience? Is it a God I can follow in good conscience? More than that, is it a God that I, as a priest, am willing to advocate for and represent? I've been wondering since the Bible study if maybe Jesus' obedience to God was not in his willingness to be tortured to death, to endure the kind of suffering I hope none of us have to face. But perhaps Jesus' act of obedience to God was his willingness to become human and fully live God's love, whatever the consequences. Because suffering is an innate part of being human. I can't tell you why. It's a fundamentally unanswerable question that has a whole theological term dedicated to it, theodicy, which is the question, why would an all-loving and all-powerful God allow us to suffer? I don't know. I can theorize that there is no real freedom in our existence without the ability to choose between love and sin. Is the Garden of Eden truly paradise on earth if the tree of knowledge of good and evil isn't there? I can speculate that there's no really knowing what joy is without knowing its opposite experience in pain. But as the prophet Isaiah writes, God's thoughts are not my thoughts. God's ways are not my ways. All I know, all that I'm sure of, is that suffering is a condition of this human life. Jesus said, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me." He didn't say, make a cross or build a cross. He said, take up your cross, because the cross is already there. Suffering is already there. It's how we engage that suffering that shows us what kind of disciples we are. And being a disciple can be hard. Jesus makes no bones about it. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake, for the sake of the gospel, will save it. The root of so much suffering is sin. And what is sin? We talked about this last week. Sin is anything that willfully ignores or denies relationship or are at one-ment with one another. Craving what other people have, clinging to the abundance we have while others are in need, causing harm and destruction to maintain power over others. Living God's love flies in the face of all of that. In a sinful world, living the values Jesus taught us, living with integrity, often leads to suffering. It sometimes means sacrificing comfort for the sake of our neighbor. It sometimes means sacrificing our safety for the sake of justice. And justice, as Cornel West says, is what love looks like in public. So again, I wonder, maybe Jesus' act of obedience to God was his willingness to become human and fully live God's love in this sinful world, whatever the consequences. And we all know what those consequences were. Betrayal by his friends, humiliation, a crown of thorns, and finally, the cross. We'll take that journey with him during Lent and through Holy Week. And it's a journey many disciples have taken in the centuries after Jesus. Annalena Tonelli was a Roman Catholic missionary in Kenya and Somalia. Her main work was tuberculosis treatment, and she helped treat and save thousands of people. But she also spoke out against the practice of female circumcision, a brutal but traditional practice in Somalia, which brought her death threats and attempts on her life. She also had the audacity to believe that people with AIDS should be treated with care and full medical attention. She brought them into the hospital where she worked in Barama in Somaliland. Protesters threw stones through the windows of the hospital and accused her of bringing the disease to them. But she didn't back down. She continued living God's love in this world by treating the most vulnerable in her community. For that, some of her hospital staff was violently beaten, and she herself was attacked multiple times. And finally, in 2003, she was shot and killed on the grounds of the hospital. She could have chosen to back down. She could have set down her cross and found a safer, more comfortable way to live. But Annalena Tonelli persisted. She persisted in living God's love in a fearful, sinful world. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said in his last speech the day before he was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. He says, longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know today that we, as a people, will get to the promised land. Annalena Tonelli and Martin Luther King Jr. did not intentionally seek out suffering. No, they sought, as Jesus did, to obey God, which is to bring God's love and healing and justice into the world, no matter what. Wherever they saw sin in this world, wherever they saw broken relationship because of poverty, because of structural injustice, because of cruelty, they sought atonement at one meant. They took up their cross and lost their life for the sake of the gospel. As disciples, we're not called out to seek suffering. We're called to live God's love, no matter what. Few, if any of us, will encounter the kind of suffering that these martyrs, these saints, endured. Your different gifts, your different ways of being, bring you into different situations. You may not seek out some of the most economically neglected places in the world to bring healing, though our friend Linda Simmons does. You can ask her about it. You may not rouse crowds of thousands with your stirring words. Those may not be your gifts. Those places may not be your place. But your cross is still right there, at your job, on the streets of downtown Gresham, all around you in these pews, in your living room, in your bathroom mirror. You have so many opportunities to help heal the sin in this world, to take up that cross, to acknowledge and repair relationship, to spread God's love. And every opportunity matters. Amen.